Um, my name is Michelle Zacks, and I am the Associate Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center. Normally, these programs are moderated by our director, David Blight, but unfortunately, he's come down with COVID. So he's at home trying to recuperate, and you've got me in his place. So we're so delighted to open up this GLC at Lunch series this semester with Ms. Darlene Kascak. Did I get that right?
Close.
Close, sorry. You can correct me. Um, uh, as our first presenter. And before I introduce her, I just want to say a few words about the inspiration for having Darlene be presenting today. So some of you are aware that we are kicking off the Yale and Slavery Teaching Institute this year. And that's being run by our Director of Education and Public Outreach, Deja Brabham. And it's going to be a 4-year program that involves, a series of webinars and in-person professional development programs for teachers in Connecticut and also throughout the New England region. And it is inspired by the Yale and Slavery book that David Blight was the lead author on, with Michael Morand and Hope McGrath also contributing chapters to the book, and based on a great deal of research by the Yale and Slavery Research Program. So using the book as a springboard, this teaching institute will take place over 4 years, as I say. And one of the first themes that we're going to be focusing on is Indigenous histories in New England, in Connecticut and New England. And I think at this point, it looks like the first in-person summer program dealing with that theme will be in the summer of 2026. And Deja Brabham has put together a really tremendous planning committee for that theme, with members of tribal communities throughout Connecticut, and she's in the stage of networking also with other communities, in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and the region. So because of that, we thought it would be a great opportunity to invite Darlene and other Indigenous peoples and scholars, non-native scholars of Indigenous history, to present some of their work and their knowledge. So that's the inspiration for having Darlene with us today. So Darlene Kascak is a member of the Schaghticoke Tribal Nation, and she is also the Educational Outreach Ambassador for the Institute for American Indian Studies, which is in Washington, Connecticut. And as I mentioned, she's a member of the planning committee for the Yale and Slavery Teaching Institute. She has extensive experience as an educator, tour guide, museum assistant, and traditional Native American storyteller. And all of these things have taught her the importance of educating young and old people about the many misperceptions and stereotypes about her ancestors. Her style of teaching from a Native American viewpoint allows children and adults the opportunity to have a new understanding of Connecticut's Indigenous peoples' lives, both in the past and the present. So with that, welcome, Darlene, and we look forward to hearing from you. After Darlene presents, we'll open up to Q&A, and you can enter your questions in the chat. Thanks.
Okay. Well, welcome, everybody. First of all, I just want you to know that I am a regular person. I'm not a scholar. I'm an Indigenous person who has had experiences with the way that history has been taught. So I developed this program to give people a different viewpoint. As a storyteller, this program is told in more of a storytelling fashion. So let me begin. Okay. So this program is going to introduce you to the life in the Eastern Woodlands. And I want you to think about, how do we learn about the Indigenous people who lived in the past in this area? Through scientific methods such as archaeology, which is the study of past peoples through the objects that they leave behind. These objects that they find are called artifacts. Now, it's really cool working at a museum. I get to touch and feel and experience so many wonderful things. For example, that's myself with my head inside the bottom jaw of a mastodon. That was pretty cool. We also learn from historical documents written by European people when they visited here. They wrote about what they observed on this new land from their point of view. But artifacts and written documents by European people could only tell part of the history. Whose voice has been left out? Indigenous people did not have a written language that, Europeans can study. We had a different way, and still have a different way, of recording our history and the way that we did things. They were passed down from one generation to the next through oral traditions such as storytelling. They recorded their history through art, ceremonial songs, and dances. For many years, this method of preserving their history was ignored and silenced, and only the European perspective about them has been told. But as I said, artifacts can only tell part of the story. Let me share a personal story with you. When my son was 8 years old, we visited a museum here in Connecticut, a very famous museum. And there was an exhibit, and it said primitive technology. And there was a stone axe. And my son looked at that and he said, "Mom, were my ancestors stupid? Were they dumb? It must have taken a year to chop a tree down using that dull stone axe." And I thought about it, and I thought about how he's only seeing things from one point of view, and that this exhibit did not exactly tell people how this tool was used. That could only be told by the Indigenous people. So I could see that it affected the way he thought about his ancestors, that he felt ashamed and embarrassed, by this exhibit. So when we got home, I thought I needed to show him a valuable lesson. When we got home, I handed him a bucket and I said, "Junior, please go over to the river and grab some of our thick mud that we have over there." So he grabbed his bucket of mud and he came back. Then I said, "Find a stone about the same size, kind of the same shape as what we saw in the exhibit." And actually, he found a very good one with a pointed end on one side. Then we wandered around the yard, looking for just the right tree. We found one, and I explained to him that we were taking the life of this tree and that we needed to be honorable and respectful and make sure that we weren't just killing this tree, for me to show you how it was chopped down. We need to give it a purpose when we're through. So I ran inside the house. I got my fire making equipment. I got my 2 clamshells, and we began. I had him paint a stripe around the tree about 2 feet up from the ground, a big band. And he had a ball doing that. And then I set the tree on fire down at the roots. And that fire burned and burned, forming red hot coals. I took my 2 clamshells and I moved those red hot coals over to one side of the tree. Now, one side of that tree is burning more than the other, and red hot coals are starting to form on that tree. I instructed my son to grab that stone and chip away at some of those red hot coals. And as he did that, those red hot coals started to burn deeper and deeper and deeper into the tree. Soon, well, maybe an hour, we started to hear noise. We started to hear crackling, and that tree started to do this. I instructed my son to grab that stone tool and bang on the other side of the tree to help it fall down, which he did, and crack, that tree landed on the ground. He looked at me and he said, "Mom, that was brilliant. They weren't using a silly stone to chop a tree down. It was much more than that. They were using fire, and they knew how to control that fire." And I could see that his attitude about his ancestors completely changed. So then he had to learn lesson number 2. You don't take the life of a tree without giving it a purpose. I said, "What would you like to do with this tree now that we've taken its life?" And he had several ideas, building, a bench, using it for firewood. He had several. And he said, "You know what I would really like to do? I would love to build a small dugout canoe." And I smiled. And I said, "Okay, how do you think you would go about doing that?" He grabbed his bucket. He ran over to the river. He started grabbing more mud. He came back to that tree and he packed the mud onto the top of that tree in the areas that he did not want it to burn. And then I picked up red hot coals with my clamshells and I placed it on the parts of that tree that he did not have protected by mud. And it would burn and he'd scrape, and it would burn and he'd scrape. And it took us several weeks because we weren't doing it 24 hours a day. But in time, he was able to construct a small dugout canoe. Actually, his little tukus could fit perfectly inside. And he learned a valuable lesson that day, that others telling our stories doesn't always give them the complete picture, and that he needed to look beyond that. The way that we teach isn't by writing things down in a book. The way that we teach is by showing and having them do it. So it's a whole different way of learning. He learned a very valuable lesson. Which brings me to, what are the things that we learn and how do we learn them? I'm going to show you several images that you've probably grown up with. They're probably in your history books when you were growing up. And these pictures are coming from one point of view, from the European perspective, right? But they have deep, deep messages that, are being embedded into your brain. When you look at this picture, what do you see? Just take a moment to really look. Notice where the light is shining and where it's dark, right? Notice who and what they're featuring. So in here, this is Christopher Columbus landing on this land, staking claim to it, planting a flag in it. We could see a hierarchy amongst that group. There are people that are more important than others. For example, you could see certain people who are the workers, let's say. Down in the bottom right-hand corner, an 8-year-old explained it to me this way, and it was beautiful. He said, you could tell that they are like lesser than those other people because they're actually in the water and they're holding on to those, small vessels. The one on the bottom, you could see him holding a rock, trying to steady that canoe kind of thing. And then there's another person in the water holding a second boat. And this was so that he called him Mr. Fancy White Pants or White Tights. He said, so that Mr. Fancy White Tights could walk from one boat to the other without getting wet. We talked about what were the different weapons that we see. What are the weapons that we see the Native American people with? Nothing, right? But the new arrival, the new people that, arrived here had weapons of war. They had swords, they had guns, they had crosses, which was used as a weapon here as well. Now, if you notice the indigenous people, they're off on the left side of this picture. They're in the dark, they're in the shadows. They look afraid. And they're naked. I don't know why they always show us as being naked, but that's just the way it is. So think about these images and how they affect the way that you think about the indigenous people and about Christopher Columbus coming here and claiming this land. Other pictures that really influence the way that we think are examples of the Thanksgiving meal. The one that sticks out to me is this one. Look at that young girl. She's looking at the native people with fear in her eyes, right? The native people are, in this picture, at least they're sitting at a table. In a lot of other Thanksgiving pictures, they're sitting on the ground, throwing their bones and shells, all around them. Now, this particular picture got me into trouble when I was in school because I know the true Thanksgiving story, and it was nothing like this. I also pointed out things like the clothing that the indigenous people were wearing. I work with leather. I dye leather. I, do all types of work with leather. I would never be able to achieve a blue like that out of deerskin. And the feathers that they're wearing are coming from South America. So they're not even feathers that are used in this area. And it's not the type of headdress that we wore. There's so many inaccuracies in these stories that we grow up learning. And, these images help, help tell that story in an inaccurate way. Now, I also think this. If you know about the Pilgrim's Journey here, it was no Disney cruise ride. It was rough. And when they landed here, it was in the winter, and they had to continue to live on those boats while they built homes and such. Now, if you have that many people packed into a boat, if you've traveled that long distance, if you needed to bring things with you to a new place, would you have fancy china with you? No, of course not. But it's another image that shows civilized versus uncivilized. I'm sure you've all seen this one, Manifest Destiny. Look at the lighting and what's going on in this image. The light is shining on her. She's holding a Bible. She's laying down telegraphic lines. You could see on the right off in the distance, progress is happening. Ships are there. You could see trains, wagons, and such. On the left-hand side of the picture, once again in the dark, you see the native people fleeing and running. You see the buffalo running as well. There's so much going on in this picture. Once again, showing that perspective from one side. Now, this picture of Manifest Destiny challenges that perspective. This is by an indigenous painter, indigenous artist. Notice what she's doing. She's leading the animals back. She's leading the people back. She's tearing up those telegraph lines. You could see the pollution on the right-hand side of this picture. How the water's polluted, the air is polluted. There's factories, there's, all this destruction that happened. And she's bringing back some of those old ways. So I just love the difference between these two pictures. So the presentation I'm going to give you today is going to be a little different than the history that you might have learned in school. It's going to be coming from you from an Itwapmunk point of view. Itwapmunk means two-eyed seeing, learning to see things from one eye through Western science, archaeology, anthropology, all historians and such. But from the other eye, it's going to be coming from a Native American perspective. And when you use those two eyes together, you get a more clear, accurate picture. So let's start with the name of this place. The indigenous people called this place Quinnetukut. And in our language, that means the place of the long water. Our language is very descriptive that way. It gives life and spirit to objects. They're not just things to us. And a lot of the words that we use today come from those indigenous origins. So when Europeans came and they heard the indigenous people referring to this place as Quinnetukut, they spelled it differently. They changed the pronunciation, and that's where we got Connecticut from. Now, if you think about the word Connecticut, what does that really mean? Does it describe anything? No, it's just an it, okay? There's a lot of words that, you're probably familiar with, a lot of places that you're familiar with. I love when I'm teaching younger students, and when we talk about different animals. Chipmunk is an Algonquian word that means he who descends from trees. Raccoon is another Native American word, he who washes. If you've ever observed a raccoon, they love to wash their hands, especially when they're eating. I know they're in and out of our garbage, but their instinctual ways are to wash their food and wash their hands. Another word is moose, which is big twig breaker. There's no way a moose is going to sneak up upon you. You hear that moose coming. My favorite of all is skunk. Fox-like creature who squirts. Does that not embody the spirit of that living being? So do you see the difference in the way our language described things? It gave it a spirit. It gave it a life. It was a being that, deserved honor and respect. It wasn't just a thing. Some place names that you might recognize. Hammonasset, place with sandbars and islands. And if you've ever gone there, that's exactly what it looks like. Little sandbar islands. Wassapog, pond with small round stones. And if you ever swam there, you'd know exactly what I'm talking about. Lake Warramong, great fishing place. The word Pagusset means where the river widens. The term Schaghticoke means where two waters come together, but it also means where people come together. So do you see the difference in the way our words were so descriptive? So let's begin using that two-eyed seeing point of view to talk about the history of this place. My ancestors, my grandparents, great-grandparents, used to tell a story about a time when our people walked upon the ice. And they lived a different lifestyle. They were constantly on the move, looking for food. Some of the food that they hunted were beavers that were the size of bears. And they describe hunting a huge, hairy animal with a flat back, a long, long nose, and horns coming out of its face. They're talking about the mastodon. Now, for years, historians and archaeologists laughed at us for that story. Oh, those silly people and their monsters, in their fairy tales. until giant beaver remains were found in Pennsylvania, and they were the size of a bear. And then here in Connecticut, there was a mastodon found. And some of the mastodons found in this area show evidence of people harvesting meat from those bones. So it places Native American people back in that time. And it also validates that story that I grew up hearing, which I just love when archaeology, validates our stories. So much of the land was covered with ice. It was holding back the waters. If you look at the map on the left, that's the map of this area. You could see that during that time, the Long Island Sound wasn't there. There was a lake called Lake Flushing. There was a connecting landmass from Rhode Island over to Long Island. So this land was completely different than what we see. There was little growing here. People that came here weren't staying for a very long time. They were just coming here to gather resources, continuously on the move. 12,000 years ago, they're living in small lean-to type structures, going from one place to the other, so they weren't staying long. And the tools that they made came from the stones that they found in their area. But you could also find stones that came from other places like chert. Now, we don't know whether they originally, visited that area or if they traded for those materials. A lot is still unknown. Eight 8,000 years ago, things start to change. Those glaciers are continuing to melt. When those glaciers melt, more plants start to grow, which attracts more animals to this area, which of course attracts more people. The groups are starting to get larger. They're traveling across this land from one place to the other. They're eating with the seasons. So perhaps they would go down near the ocean to gather the gifts from the sea in the summertime. And then in the fall, they might travel inland to hunt some of the larger animals. So they're constantly moving, going from one place to another. Their way of thinking was a bit different. Land was shared. In fact, there is no word in our language for owning land. That was a concept that didn't exist. Now, our interaction with living beings was also different. And this is something else I'm going to share with you during this presentation, the thoughts of our culture. We believe that we are no more important than any other living being, that I am equal to a blade of grass, I am equal to a bug on the ground, or a deer in the forest. That, our creation story talks about how this world was created by the animals first, and how they figured everything out, how they lived in balance. And it was the human beings that came along last. So we need to be humble enough to understand the knowledge that these animals had. Well, there's a lot of things that Indigenous people learned from these animals about what they could eat, what wasn't safe, how they could do things differently. For example, when they're moving from place to place, let's say, going from the ocean inland, would you want to carry all those heavy stone tools? No, neither would they. So what they would do in each one of these locations is when they were finished harvesting what they needed, they would dig a hole in the ground and bury the tools that they needed for the resources they were gathering at the time. They covered over, they leave a little marking so that they could find it again. And they learned this by watching squirrels. Squirrels gather walnuts, they dig a hole in the ground, they call it a cache. They bury their walnuts so that they can go back to those areas and, have food during the winter months when, there isn't much available. So they learned and observed and had a different connection to living beings than what we did. "5,000 years ago, those waterways start settling down and they're, changing. And Native people started utilizing those waterways for food. They would build brush weirs, sticks in the water, in the mud, forming a corral that they would steer fish into. They would build stone weirs, stone walls that steered fish into netting. They would weave together baskets for fishing as well. So their lives are changing. The things are starting to get different in their worlds. They now have another food source as well. About 2,500 years ago, they begin shaping new life ways. Now that they have the ability to travel on water, this became monumental because now they're able to go to other places to gather resources and to come back. They also start using new technologies. For example, 8,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, they're hunting with a spear. Now, if you throw a spear at a bear, are you going to kill that bear? No. You're going to annoy the bear. It's going to chase you. And now you're without a spear, right? That's pretty dangerous. So they were hunting at the time with a spear in a jabbing motion, which meant they had to get up close to that animal in order to take it down. And most likely they were hunting in groups, especially when they were hunting mastodon. So they had to improve on that, right? And about 2,500 years ago, they started using a technology with a device so cool, they named it twice. It's called the atlatl or atlatl. And what that does is it's like an extension on your arm. It has it's a stick with an extension, like a extension on your arm, has a small hook on the end that would go into the end of a spear. And then now when they're throwing that spear, that little hook on the end is like a fulcrum, and that extension of their arm allows them to throw that atlatl farther. So, and it impacts harder than it would just on its own. So they're developing new ways to do things. Now, the best example of an atlatl, if you've never experienced one, is you may have used a modern device for throwing a tennis ball to your dog. Okay, it's called the chuck it. Same principle, right? It's an extension on your arm. That extension allows you to throw that tennis ball longer, farther, and impacts a bit harder, right? They were in earlier days, their cooking vessels were made out of stone, which is very heavy. Imagine taking that down to the river to wash. So they improved by using some of the mud and the clay found in their areas near the waterways. So once again, improving on the way that they're doing things. And this is also when village life began. Now that they had the ability for hunters and gatherers to leave and return on vessels that traveled in the water, it was no longer necessary for the entire group to walk and move from place to place. They would have winter settlements, they would have summer settlements, and so on, but they weren't constantly on the move. They were now able to stay in one place for longer periods of time. A 1,000 years ago, corn makes its way up here to Connecticut. And once again, this was a vital improvement in their lives. When you go hunting and gathering, you're not sure what you're going to come back with. But when you plant a garden, you could visually see how much food you're going to have, right? Now, what's fascinating about this is the seeds themselves were traded all the way from South America, making their way up to Connecticut. And those seeds were corn, beans, and squash. But the method of planting was also traded through storytelling. And that made its way from South America all the way up to Connecticut as well. And their method of planting these three plants together was ingenious. They would plant corn in the middle. Corn grows up tall, right? Around the corn, they would plant green beans. Green beans need something tall to wrap around. At the base of that hill, they would plant pumpkins, gourds, or squash, plants that had big leaves that would keep moisture in the soil, would keep the weeds down, and those prickly vines would keep the critters away. I just love the story and how it was shared and how it explains the way of planting. The corn was represented by the eldest sister. She was tall. She had long golden hair. She's wrapped in a green cape. The middle sister is kind of the wild child. She's always reaching for the stars, climbing here and there and going here and there. She's also wearing a green cape. The pumpkins, gourds, or squash was represented by the baby sister, the one who creeps and crawls on the ground. She goes this way and she goes that way, right? So it's really pretty cool how not only the seeds made it here, but that method of planting made it here through these stories. Now, what's really remarkable about this is through observation, they realized that these three plants were helping each other grow. That's why they named them the three sisters, because much like sisters growing up, they help each other out. The corn in the middle is depleting the soil of nutrients, of nitrogen. The green beans around it are putting nitrogen back into the soil. So that soil is kept in balance year after year, planting after planting. Unlike the way that Europeans came and gardened, we still do it today, rows of corn, 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 corn. Well, that corn is taking all the nutrients out of the soil. And after so many years, that soil becomes dead. And then the farmers have to treat that soil with different chemicals, trying to get nitrogen back into that soil. And those chemicals are running off into the waterways, causing pollution and such. If they would only embraced and learned this method of planting, maybe we could be doing things differently today. Now, in our culture, remember I said everything is a relative, okay? Plants and animals. So when we took the life of a plant, there was a ceremony that would happen. For example, when we harvested the corn, we would take the husks of that corn and we would dry them out and we would weave beautiful baskets. We would weave rugs. We would weave moccasins, shoes to wear. We would make dolls for our children. The corn cob itself was dried and used for many things. It could be a plug in a gourd canteen. It could be used as a fire starter. It could be used as insulation inside the home. So out of respect for that living being that sacrificed its life for us, we utilize every bit of it that we can. And we're raised this way. When I was young, my favorite thing in the world was strawberries. So my auntie invited us up to the reservation to go on a wild strawberry hunt. I was so excited. So after she explained what the plants looked like and such, we set off into the woods. I saw my first strawberry. I was so excited. I dove in and I started going pop, 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 eating them up as fast as I could. From a distance, I hear my auntie. uh. You don't take the first plant you see, because that may be the only plant in this area. And if you take everything from that plant, there'll never be strawberries here again. You must wait until you see more strawberries. I was so disappointed. So we wandered a little bit farther. My cousin spotted a big patch. I went running over, dove in, pop, 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 pop. Once again, uh. She said to me, you only take 1/3 of the strawberries for yourself. You leave 1/3 of the strawberries for the animals, because if animals don't eat, we don't eat. And you leave 1/3 of the strawberries to drop as seeds so future generations could eat. And this is how we lived in harmony and balance on this land for thousands and thousands of years, by being mindful of how we took things from this land. We also have a way of thinking that is different than European thinking. Europeans pretty much thought about their own 85 years on this planet. They didn't think about future generations. So everything they did to the land was for their own purpose, for their own needs. In our way of thinking, we think about 7 generations, and there's many ways to describe this, but basically what it means is that when I was born, I knew that generations behind me had me in mind. Anytime there was a major decision to be made, they would ask themselves, how is this going to affect the land? How is this going to affect the children in the future? How is this going to affect the water? So they had me in mind, and often had to sacrifice and go without, because they had, were trying to keep everything in balance and keep everything sustainable. I also know that in my lifetime, it's my responsibility to think generations ahead and make decisions in the same way. So here on my property, I think about those next generations. Long after I'm gone, someone else is going to be living on this property. So I'm careful and mindful about what I do to it. I hate ticks. Lord, I hate ticks. But I know if I spray my yard with chemicals, not only do I kill the ticks, but I kill other bugs as well. And that there are brothers and sisters, living beings, that depend upon those bugs for their survival. So what I do to one species has an effect on other species, even ourselves. That poison that I spray on my yard, when it rains, it washes down into the river. Those poisons now are flowing in that river, and they're going to your house and the next house and the next house and the next house. So we interact differently. To get rid of the ticks, I've got guinea hens, because they feed upon the ticks. So you find a solution that is going to have the least amount of impact. We also had that same way of thinking about hunting. Here's what I was instructed about deer hunting. I was great with a shotgun. I could shoot every can off the fence. So they wanted to, take me hunting. I went with the men, and they explained to me certain protocols that we have in place. First of all, you don't shoot the first deer, because that might be the only deer. You wait until you see a healthy population. And then it goes a step further. They instructed me to wait until one of the deer gave me permission. It would be sacrificing its life and giving itself to me so that I could sustain myself. All the rest of the deer would run away, but there would be one that would stay there. And if you didn't have that experience, if one deer didn't stay, if they all ran away, then you went home empty-handed. So that's how we interacted with the world. That's how we were able to make sure that you know, we still enjoy some of these beautiful animals and plants today. So once again, I'm going to talk a little bit about our village life before contact. In our communities, everyone shared. No one had more or less than anyone else. If you were a hunter and you brought back a deer, that deer would be shared amongst the entire community. If you came back with food from, foraging, same thing. It would be shared with everyone. No one had more or less. Everyone had responsibilities to that community, from the youngest of children to the eldest of elders. The young children perhaps could collect firewood, could harvest in the garden, or fruits and vegetables and such. They all had responsibilities. The elders would be the storytellers. The storytellers were the teachers. They would teach the next generation how to interact with this world, how to live in a sustainable way. And they would teach them how to be good human beings through cute little stories about talking animals that get themselves into trouble. But those stories have valuable life lessons woven into them. One of the things that drove me crazy in school is they used to talk about boy jobs and girl jobs in Native communities. That was not true. You did what made most sense for the community. If a girl was good with a bow and arrow and she was a good hunter, that's what she was destined to do. If a man was not good with that hunting tool, then maybe he's better off building homes and tools and such. It all depended on your talents and your skills. We also recognize 5 genders. We recognize men and women. We recognize women who have a bit of a masculine side. We recognized men who might have a more feminine side. And then we recognized 2-spirit people, someone with the body of one gender and the spirit of another. And those 2-spirit people were held in high regard because they had the ability to see things through 2 different points of view. In our communities, we had a checks and balances in place. We had a chief and a leader. We had an elders council, and we had a women's council. Now, women, typically because they were, child rearers, they would stay more close to the village, and they had control over the garden. They had their finger on it. They knew how much food we were going to have. They knew, how healthy the garden was. If a chief or a leader wanted to go off to war, he had to get the approval of both of those councils. If the women felt that there was not enough food, or maybe it was harvest season, they could stop that from happening. It wouldn't be a good time to leave when the big harvest is coming in, or when there's not a lot of food, or when there's danger around. They would need the men for protection. So it was a checks and balances. The women also had the authority to take a chief or a leader out of that position if they weren't leading the people in a good way. And they would also recommend who would be most worthy to lead the tribe after that. So, like I said, the women had a lot of power in our communities. Here's another example of some of the jobs children would have. There's a platform out in the garden that the children would stand on, and they would shake a rattle, throw rocks, do whatever they could do to chase the birds and the critters out of that garden. And then others start coming here, which had a big impact on the way that they were living. Now, at first, it was European explorers and fishermen who started to come here in the beginning of the 16th century. And when they first came here, they weren't here to take everything. They were here to discover and learn about this land. And they started trading with the native people. So for the first time, Native American people were exposed to things that made their lives easier, such as cloth. Now, before that, they were hunting an animal, tanning the animal's hide, cutting it with a stone tool, sewing it with a bone needle and sinew. Well, now they had been exposed and had, opportunities to use metal scissors, metal knives. So it's improving their lives. Different ways of doing things, metal cooking pots, and so on. They were able to trade what they had, which was food, for these items that would make their lives a bit easier. Now, one of the misunderstandings was how we thought about wampum. Wampum is made out of a purple quahog shell, only found in our area, and it was given as a gift of honor, a gift of respect. And it was often given to our chiefs, our leaders. It was given to, people of big importance. Well, when the Dutch see this wampum and how the leaders are wearing it, they considered it to be a form of money. And then the Dutch started to mass produce it, where it kind of lost its meaning, its original meaning. So there was some good and some bad in these, trades and exchanges. Now, one of them that they did not expect was the trading of diseases. Europeans came here, and they had a different lifestyle back home. They domesticated animals. And when you domesticate animals, you come in exposure of that animal's feces, its, oozes, things that animals ooze, right? And those are what causes diseases, such as smallpox, plagues, cholera, whooping cough, and measles, and so on. So when European people came here, they were carriers of these diseases. But the European people over time built up immune systems, built up knowledge on how to treat it. Native American people, on the other hand, never domesticated animals, so they never came in contact with these types of diseases before. And when they did, it devastated their bodies. They had no immune systems to fight it. They had no knowledge of how to treat it. And being the type of people they were, when they saw their village dying from disease, the healthy ones would run off to warn other villages, therefore further spreading those diseases. It is said that during this time, it is estimated that 80% of Connecticut's indigenous people died from disease. It wasn't from wars. So now their communities are devastated. They're unable to function. And this is when the merging of tribes began. Now, being in a weakened state, they were easily forced and pushed away from their lands. And we all know history, how, they were forced to assimilate. I like to say that we didn't assimilate, we adapted. For example, my tribe, the Schaghticoke tribe, realized the importance of certain things. They realized for their own safety that it was better if they aligned with some of these ways of thinking. They realized that their children needed to understand this new world that was being thrust upon them. They needed to understand how to read and write the English language. And, we had many different ways that we adapted. For example, my tribe invited the church of their choice onto our reservation at a time when that was being forced upon others. We took the initiative to find the right group of people that were going to help represent us in the right way. Now, it was the Moravian Church, and they were very respectful. They allowed us to be who we were. They didn't try to detribalize us. They allowed us to go off and practice our traditions, and kept, had a blind eye to it. So we all had to go through different things, depending on where you were from and what your needs were. Down along the coast, they needed to be a little bit more aggressive because, things were different in different parts of the state. Now, during that time of forced assimilation, we weren't allowed to openly practice our religion, our way of doing things, our ceremonies and such. But we were able to keep those traditions going and tell those stories in a different way. We told it through art. Now, Europeans would, had a need for baskets, for brooms, for cane chairs and such, and our people supplied them with that. It became a way for them to survive. They were not used to having to worry about money, but this became a way for them to bridge that gap. But on those baskets that were being passed around amongst the European people, and they're commenting on, oh, what beautiful artwork. Those baskets are actually telling a story about that person and that tribe. For example, if you see medallions, they're called rosettes, that's typically from tribes living east of the Connecticut River. The domes represent the four directions that guide the traveler and call the winds. The medallions are used to represent a community or tribe as a whole. So for basket makers, it was a way of continuing to tell their story and talk about their identity. The four domed medallions on this painting, on this basket, is a Mohegan design, and it represents a story of no matter how scattered our people may be, where they are living outside of their ancestral lands, they are still considered part of those tribes. So our stories of survival during recent times continue. We still practice our way of doing things, our way of teaching through ceremonies, our way of teaching and recording history through our artwork. When we dance and sing, that's how we pray. It's also how we talk about, not talk about, but show the way that we did things in the past. So each individual dance is telling a story about our people. This is my cousin Erin on the left. She's a traditional powwow dancer. And all of that beadwork that she's wearing is telling a valuable story. It's telling a story about our family. Different colors represent different things. Flowers may represent, yellow flowers may represent the males in the family. Pink flowers may represent the women in the family, and so on. So it tells a story. Here's some of the ways that Indigenous people are telling their stories today. These are two beaded cuffs by Golden Hilpagussit leader in the past. And it's telling a lot about this person. He was part of AIM, the American Indian Movement, and he was also part of the Black Panthers. Now, what's really interesting is that two-eyed seeing, right? When one of our interns put these two bands into a case, she described the one on the right as AIM, and the one on the left she described as some mythical Black Panther that, is known in a different part of the country in legends and fairy tales. And I tried to explain to her, you don't know this man. I knew this man. This is Chief Piper from the Golden Hilpagussit, who has since passed. I said, he was very involved in the American Indian movement and in the Black Indian movement because he was a Black native. And that was a story that our museum wasn't really used to hearing. So we had to change, some of the ways of thinking. We tell the story of the pipeline through various paintings. This is an awesome thing to see. And he comes to a festival called Schaghticoke at Mashantucket Pequot every year. This person is describing his identity by beadwork on his motorcycle. And it is so beautiful. The detail and the story that it tells is wonderful. This is a present day two-spirit person who is a basket maker. And basket makers are traditionally a man's job, but he puts that feminine point of view into it. He is a phenomenal person, and someone that we really aspire to keep that two-spirit tradition and way of thinking going. And we also represent ourselves in many different ways with modern materials. For example, on the left, that's a wedding dress worn by somebody in my tribe who used white deer skin so that it was similar to the white wedding dresses that people wear today. Here are two sneakers, beaded up with things that are important to these two people. And then on the right, there's a movement in Indian country to bring healthy activities to our communities. And skateboarding happens to be one of them. So, you could see the images on this skateboard are representing that individual as well. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop share. Okay.
Wow. Thank you so much. So much to think about and absorb. Really, really appreciate your presentation. We have a bunch of questions, so I'll just try to briefly kick things off with some things that are on my mind. Now, again, my pronunciation is probably terrible, but a top, the two-eyed seeing. Can you pronounce that again?
Monk. Monk.
Etwap monk. I guess I don't know how to say this succinctly, but given the legacy of Western bias and stereotyping and racism in the development of sciences and sort of intellectual traditions, what are the challenges you see in that two-eyed seeing? Can it be done successfully and respectfully in contemporary times? Certainly science and other Western academic disciplines have a lot to offer all of us, but there are obvious challenges as well. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Our museum has embraced this two-eyed seeing. Like the story of that axe, right? It's all in how you tell that story and where your information is coming from. So we've always, we are including native voices to help interpret those items to make sure that we're telling them in a correct way. Look at the example of that beadwork from Aurelius Piper, Chief Piper. They didn't know that person. They didn't know what that person stood for. He was very, very strong in, both AIM and the Black Panther movement, being a Black native himself. So it could have gone a completely different way with a different story that wasn't accurate. So you need these Indigenous voices to come in and help explain, sometimes in a better way. And not that Native people know everything. This is part of the reason why we do oral tradition, because we feel if you write something down, whatever that information is, stays that way forever. That book sits on a shelf, people pick it up, they read it, and that's what they think is the truth. Even though new discoveries may come along that change that, original writing. And that's the beauty of storytelling, that it changes, it grows, It, incorporates new things that come up. So we try to keep that in mind at our museum.
Yeah,
Now, I've seen two-eyed seeing be used in education, how we teach children, by having them experience something. They watch, they learn, they repeat, you know, instead of just handing them a book, right? And sheets, have them experience it. At our museum and our education programs, they touch, they feel, they understand the concept. We put a pile of bones and stones and wood on the table, and we say, okay, build some tools, you know? So having them think in a different way by experiencing something.
yeah,
It's been used in the medical industry, childbirth. For years, people, had their children laying flat on their back, working against nature. So the baby has to come up and out, right? And that was for the benefit of the doctor. Now we're incorporating different ways of a woman sitting down, working with nature rather than against it.
yeah,
It could be used in so many ways, and it is
yes,
being used in so
yeah,
many ways.
yeah.
Ecology,
Mhm.
you know, who better knows about this land than the people that have lived here since time memorial, right? We understand how certain things work. We have experience on floods in certain areas and so on, you know, so
Yeah.
it can be used in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think consciously and even unconsciously, what you were saying about everything is in relationship and, building Native people building their knowledge based on a sense of humility and respect and equality. I mean, one can see that sort of trickling through contemporary social sciences and other methodologies that are trying to, be much more relational rather than top down.
Hmm.
So, well, I guess I want to just quickly ask you about, the Yale and Slavery Project, the Teaching Institute. Do you have any thoughts that you could share about whether or how um, the book and the projects that are coming out of it might help improve, the understanding of Indigenous history in Connecticut and in the region. And I know there's also, we haven't talked about it, but there's curricular programs in the state Department of Education that are
I've been a
trying to,
part of that. Yeah,
and so do you see any potential for the work that we're doing to make improvements?
absolutely. There's a whole story that has been untold. Um, and that's that connection between Black history and Native history. People don't realize that
Yeah,
how deep that connection goes. And a lot of times people don't understand that the history here is completely different than the Native history in other parts of the country. Contact happens here first. Our communities are devastated by disease. We have, when half of your people die, right? You have less to choose from as far as who you're going to marry and so on. So in this area, we invited others into our communities. So early on, it was the French and the Dutch, especially along the trade routes. They came into our communities, they participated as part of the community, and you could see that influence in what we look like. There's a lot of lighter skinned natives along those trade routes, all the way up into Canada. Um, Along the coast, they had a different history. Along the coast, Native people were captured and used as slaves. Um, they formed friendships and bonds with other slaves. And when they were freed or escaped, they welcomed those slaves into their communities. So there was a blending there as well. And that's where you see the darker skinned natives along the coast. So there's not one way we're supposed to look, although people, you know, often judge us. Um, you don't look native to me. I wish I had a nickel for every time,
yeah,
and I say, what am I supposed to look like? Pocahontas? Well, she
right.
was a cartoon character. I'm never going to look like that. Um, But it's these deep histories and connections that, I think people need to learn about so
Yeah.
that can have a better understanding of who we are, what
Yeah.
we look like,
Mhm. Thanks. And we have a question in the Q&A about land acknowledgements, and I certainly didn't begin this program with a acknowledgement, and I apologize if for any offense that might have caused. But what is your opinion about that? And do you think that they're meaningful? And
They're meaningful if there's an action attached to it.
Mhm.
Just to say that I'm standing on native land, is one thing, but to say that and form an alliance with the local tribes is a completely other story, and also learning that history. I do a lot of coaching on land acknowledgements, people writing land acknowledgements, and, I help with helping them figure out who was on that land, because sometimes it's a little confusing and they
Yeah,
might say the wrong thing.
right.
It's intended to be a healing statement,
Yeah,
simply recognizing the people who were the stewards of that land. But it goes a step further. It needs to be a commitment for us to steward that land now,
yeah,
you know? Otherwise, it's just a statement,
yeah,
to check off on a little box.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Well, I'd love to work with you on that for us here at GLC. So let's discuss this more offline.
Okay. Now, I've seen people write them in a scolding manner, you know, where, the audience feels offended and angry, you know, like for calling them out on this ugly stuff that happened in history. My belief is you cannot blame people for what their ancestors did. Their ancestors were doing what was normal in their culture at the time. It's up to us to do better,
Yeah, yeah,
and you could only do better when you learn from it. A
yeah,
lot of times I'll be called and they'll say, I want you to do a reading of a land acknowledgement for our function. And I say, actually, it's up to you to do it. I already know you're on Indigenous land. You need to recognize that.
right. Good point. Um, just quickly for people who are asking, yes, this event is being recorded and it will be available on the GLC YouTube channel. And Daniel, maybe you can put that the link to the GLC YouTube channel in the chat. So another question about language from the audience is that you're using the term tribe. And this person wants to know if there's, among Native American people or scholars, what's the contemporary sense about those kind of language terms? Indigenous, tribes, Indian, American
Oh,
Indian, Native
it is
American.
so difficult. Um, so let's talk about terms of respect, right? We have Native American, American Indian, Indian, um, Indigenous. Oh, there's one I'm missing. But anyway, um, to me, most of them don't make any sense. Okay. Native American, to me, if you're born in this country, right, you are native to America, right? I'm Indigenous. My ancestors were here before it was America. Okay. So Native American, like, it just doesn't
Mm,
make sense.
yeah,
American Indian is also using that term Indian. But Indian is something that we'll never get rid of. Bureau of Indian Affairs. I mean,
right.
it's still used in so many different ways. And I grew up 65 years being, referred to as an Indian and referring to myself as an Indian. Um, we like to be recognized by our tribal affiliation. But that's a tall ask. I really think that's a tall ask because you may not know what tribe I'm from. How are you going to talk about, meeting an Indigenous person? Indigenous is the one I like the most,
Okay.
the one that we need to educate people on what it means,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that.
Oh, you're
I'm so looking forward to talking to you more. Um, let me see a few other questions. Somebody was asking about that Thanksgiving image that you shared. Um, do you know what tribal community that was supposed to represent?
it's supposed to represent the Wampanoag.
Okay. Okay, I don't know if there were other questions connected to that. Somebody wants to know if the Two-Spirit basket maker that you mentioned is here in Connecticut.
No, he's Passamaquoddy up in
Okay.
Maine.
Oh, okay.
Geo Neptune is his name,
Geo
or their
Neptune.
name, I should say.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Um,
Wonderful person doing wonderful work. Um, you know, in a lot of the work that I do, when I talk about those 5 genders, some kids find a lot of comfort in that, in
yeah,
going through that experience themselves.
no doubt.
Understand that there was a group of people that understood what that was all about and
Yeah,
held those people in a high regard,
yeah,
you know.
yeah. I'm so glad that you shared that. Really important that we understand.
Now with colonism, colonialism, our own people started to lose that way and started to be, prejudiced, but there's been a big resurgence for us to get back to that way of thinking. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah. Well, I'm afraid we need to wrap up. Thank you again so much. And again, for the audience, thank you for being here with us. And please visit the GLC YouTube channel for a recording of this. It'll probably take a few days, but it'll be there soon. Sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already. And stay tuned for upcoming events. I didn't post this in the chat, but we do have a couple of more events in this series on in November. We're having Akia de Barros Gomez, who's at the Mystic Seaport, talking about the exhibit that she curated, which is called Entwined, I think. But her talk for us is going to be Our Maritime Narratives, Honoring African and Indigenous Perspectives in Museum Exhibitions. That's on November 6th. And then Jason Mancini and Silver Moon Mars LaRose from the Narragansett tribe will be talking about their project on an autobiography called The Narragansett Chief, and that will be on December 4th. But thank you again, Darlene, and I'll be in touch soon.
okay.
And
And feel free to contact me at the museum, anyone, if they have any questions.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll see you at our next program.